Hello and welcome to my video. Today I'm going to go over how to upgrade the Boba Fett Jump to Lightspeed Spotlight deck into a much stronger competitive deck that you can feel comfortable taking to your store showdown or planetary qualifier. This isn't going to be an in-depth guide on how to play the deck, and it's going to assume that you know how the mechanics of the deck work, like indirect damage or piloting. If you would like a guide for this deck, please leave a comment below. As well, if you have any questions that come up while you're watching the video that I don't end up addressing, just let me know in the comments. We're going to start by going over the Spotlight deck and what it's trying to do with each card that's already in the list. Then we'll look at how to transform it into a tournament-worthy list. The final list is linked down below, so if you want to just jump to that, go ahead. I'm going to be detailed in my card swaps. So for every card that I'm putting in, I'm going to detail what card I'm taking out. That way, if there's only one card or two cards that you have that you're currently able to swap in or out, you'll know which cards to take out for it. The final deck list will include several legendary cards, and if that's not something that you have access to, at the very end I'll be showing alternatives for each of those legendaries. Let's start by talking about the identity of the Boba Fett Spotlight deck. It's a list that wants to leverage damage to overwhelm your opponent's board and win with a Boba Fett leader flip. It's a very low to the ground deck, with the highest cost card being Fett's Fire Spray Pursuing the Bounty at 6, and there's only one copy of it. In addition, there's only 2 5-cost cards as well. Due to the deck being released in Jump to Lightspeed, it has an emphasis on the 2 main mechanics being indirect damage and piloting. To support the 7 piloting cards that are in the Spotlight deck, it runs a lot of vehicles. That way you have targets to place those pilots on. It's also a deck that can deal a lot of damage through events and unit abilities, which is a unique playstyle in Star Wars Unlimited, as most of the decks deal all of their base damage through combat. Boba Fett's Any Means Necessary is the poster child of Jump to Lightspeed in my opinion. He makes great use of the new mechanic, indirect damage, as well as he can deploy as a pilot. His leader ability is as follows. When you deal non-combat damage, you may exhaust this leader. If you do, deal 1 indirect damage to a player. Non-combat damage is any damage other than what your unit deals with its power to a base or defender when attacking. Note that it doesn't specify that it must be done to an enemy. So if you attack with Fifth Brother and there are no enemy units, you're able to activate the ability off of the damage that Fifth Brother deals to himself, since it's still non-combat damage that you dealt. Something to keep in mind, that his attack as a pilot is the same as his attack as a unit. The only difference is going to be the deployability from Boba Fett gets you that 4 damage when he's deployed onto a vehicle as a pilot. But if you have concerns about your board being controlled and you want to go wide, you don't actually lose any of the attack power if he's deployed as a unit. For the people newer to Star Wars Unlimited, I want to clarify some timing confusion with Boba's ability and on-attack effects. Attacking with a unit has 3 steps to it. Declare the attack, deal combat damage, and complete the attack. After each step, you resolve all triggered abilities before moving to the next step. On-attack abilities are resolved during the declare the attack step. So if you have an on-attack that deals damage, and you want to activate Boba Fett's ability, you would activate the ability before the combat damage is dealt. So with Fifth Brother, his on-attack deals 1 damage to himself and another ground unit. So if you activate that, you're then going to be able to trigger and resolve Boba Fett's leader ability before the attack damage is dealt. Okay, let's move on to the deck. For turn 1 units, we have the First Order Stormtrooper, Allegiant General Pride, TIE Bomber, Zagirian Starhopper, and First Legion Stormtrooper. With 13 potential turn 1 plays, you're very likely going to draw into one in your opening hand. Given the composition of the deck, leading with TIE Bomber or Zagirian Starhopper is what you want to do, as it opens up lines to enable you to play your piloting units. For 3 resources, you have proactive plays with the Elite P-38 Starhopper, Houndstooth, and Fifth Brother. If you have a vehicle in play, so if you've played TIE Bomber or the Zagirian Starhopper on turn 1, you can also play any of your piloting cards for 2 resources. Proactive plays on the 4 resource turn are Bosk, Dengar, Fett's Fire Spray, Hunting Aggressor, IG-2000, and Imperial Interceptor. Bosk and Dengar don't have abilities that activate when played, so they just develop your board proactively and they will not be able to trigger your leader ability on the turn that they are played themselves. You're really going to want to play one of your 4-cost vehicles and either get some damage from your abilities right away to trigger your leader ability, or set yourself up for a lot of indirect damage with Hunting Aggressor. Fett's Fire Spray will always deal 2 indirect damage instead of 1, because Boba Fett is your leader and will always be under your control. For your 5 resource turn, you have Boba Fett and IG-88, one of each. Both are big units for your opponent to deal with, but as they don't do anything when played, you're usually going to want to take your 5 resource turn to try to ensure you have a ship ready for Boba Fett to deploy onto. This usually means playing another 4-cost ship or a 2-cost and 3-cost unit, either developing your board or controlling your opponent's side. Then, for the end of our curve, the flip turn for Boba Fett, we have 1 lone copy of Fett's Fire Spray pursuing the bounty. This is a great unit for Boba Fett, because it will always come in ready due to you always having Boba Fett under your control. If your opponent cannot interact with it right away, you can play it ready, deploy Boba Fett onto it, deal 4 damage with Boba Fett's deploy ability, and then swing for 9 damage. It is a great closing tool. The events in this deck are here to deal damage and trigger your Boba Fett leader ability. Daring Raid, Electromagnetic Pulse, Force Choke, Grenade Strike, and no disintegrations are cheap ways to push damage and trigger the ability. They can be played along a 2-cost unit on the 3 or 4 resource turn, so if you're unable to spend all your resources onto a unit, you're able to spend the rest of your resources efficiently with these cheap plays. For example, you can open turn 1 with Zagirian Starhopper, then on the second turn play Daring Raid and Dengar using piloting, and then attack for 3 damage on your unit plus 3 indirect damage from Dengar, and including Boba Fett's leader ability, you've dealt 9 damage on the second turn of the game through indirect and direct damage. That's a lot to deal with, not to mention that your opponent has to allocate where all the indirect damage goes, and that creates a lot of opportunities for your opponent to make misplays. The final event is No Good to Be Dead, which won't deal damage, but it can prevent a threat from attacking for 2 turns. It works like a get out of jail free card if your opponent is able to stick a big unit that you're not able to remove from the board. So this deck is at its best when it's getting an explosive start to the game with pilots and indirect damage right away. It puts your opponent on the back foot, forces them to try to stop you, which obviously you're not going to just roll over, so you're going to keep putting more and more damaging abilities on the board and keep racking up more damage as the game progresses. The base Spotlight deck has a lot of cards with only 1 or 2 copies, which can make for some inconsistent lines. For example, you might play 1st Legion Snow Trooper on turn 1, and then on turn 2 play 5th Brother. In both of these plays, you don't actually get to activate your abilities, you're just attacking with your units, and they're not particularly powerful alone when that's happening. So let's look at what changes can be made to make the deck much more consistent and efficient at what it wants to do. We're going to make this deck a little bit more mid-rangey, meaning that we're going to be increasing the amount of higher cost cards in the deck. To say at 50 cards, this means we're going to be cutting some of the lower cost cards, of which we have a lot of. So don't worry if you're seeing a 2-cost card being cut for a 7-cost card. We need to make that kind of exchange to draw out our curve and have a more consistent play at each turn in the game. We're going to start at the low end, our turn 1 plays. We're going to start by adding 2 copies of Allegiant General Pride in exchange for the 1st Legion Snow Troopers. While the Snow Trooper does punish your opponent for putting damage on units, it relies on cards that get damage. It's the weakest opening play in the deck, and it's a very slow card when played later on. The 2 cards have the same stats, being a 2-cost 2/3, so you're not losing anything if you're just looking at the lowest value you can get out of the card. But Pride has a huge upside when you have the initiative. When you attack with the initiative with Allegiant General Pride, he gets the 2 additional indirect damage, triggers Boba Fett's leader ability, adding another one to it. He's attacking for 5 damage with the initiative, very strong for 2 cost. Moving on to the 3-cost ground units, we're going to be adding in 2 copies of Boba Fett Disintegrator and 3 copies of Guerrilla Soldier. Boba Fett is here to strengthen the matchup against ground-based aggro like Sabine. His ability deals damage, which will trigger the leader ability, and he can be a major pain if the opponent is trying to set up on the ground and go for your base, as he punishes them for attacking base by hitting their exhausted units for that additional damage. Guerrilla Soldier is a terrific card, often dealing 4 indirect damage with your leader ability, and then coming in ready or killing a unit. To make room for these 2 cards, we're taking out 2 copies of 5th Brother and 3 of the piloting cards, whichever bring you the least joy. I personally think that Boba Fett is the strongest pilot card that comes in the starter deck, so I would hold on to him until last, but really these are okay to just pick your favorites if you're not removing them all. Pick the ones that you enjoy playing with. They all do similar things. 5th Brother is just too slow and fragile for what the deck wants to do, and the abundance of piloting cards in the deck can leave you with only weak plays if you have no vehicles out. The final ground unit that we're adding to the deck is 3 copies of Darth Vader, Scourge of Squadrons. I say ground unit, but we're really adding him in for his piloting ability. Putting Vader onto a vehicle on the second turn of the game is absolutely devastating for your opponent. If they can't answer, it will win you the game from there. For that blowout potential alone, he warrants 3 spots in the deck. We replace any 3 of the piloting cards already in the deck to make room for him. Next is the 3-cost space units. We're adding an droid missile platform because it has a very good attack stat for its cost, which your opponent will want to deal with, but then it turns around and it will punish your opponent for dealing with it with indirect damage. It's a card that will always get you some value, which is more than the Houndstooth can say, so we're replacing every copy of Houndstooth with a copy of Droid Missile Platform. At 4 cost in space, we're adding in 2 more IG-2000s and removing both of the Hunting Aggressors. I really love the Hunting Aggressor, but it can be very weak. It relies on other cards for it to really get its value, and IG-2000 is a great threat to finish off multiple units when played on curve, especially if your opponent is trying to allocate that indirect damage onto their units so that it deals the damage but the units stay alive. You get that 1 extra damage off of IG-2000 and it punishes them for that. Simply the threat of having IG-2000 in your hand can force your opponent to play differently and allocate damage more onto their base than onto their units. Next, we're going to be talking about the 6-cost space units. These are the ones that you can play on the same turn that you flip Boba Fett. Before we jump into them, I'm just going to mention that any of the 6, 7, or 8 cost cards that I'm going to show next would come in for that last copy of the 1st Legion Snow Trooper. We're going to be just fine with 12 turn 1 plays in this deck, so let's remove that other turn 1 play and get some bigger units to close the game out with. So the 6 cost units are 3 copies of Ruthless Raider and 1 more copy of Fett's Firespray Pursuing the Bounty. Ruthless Raider is just a phenomenal card, and it's even better with Boba Fett's leader ability adding 1 extra damage. With all the damage that your deck is putting out already, you're often cleaning up a unit with that damage to a unit, as well as getting some damage to base. Very good for keeping pressure on your opponent. And Fett's Firespray will always come in ready, and you can then deploy your leader onto it to swing for 9 damage in the same turn that it's played, which is nuts. I prefer 1 more copy of Ruthless Raider over an additional copy of Fett's Firespray Pursuing the Bounty, because Ruthless Raider is guaranteed value. If I play Ruthless Raider, my opponent defeats it immediately, I still get 4 damage to base and 4 damage to their units. If I play Fett's Firespray and my opponent defeats it immediately, I'm just out those 6 resources and I haven't gained much aside from what my opponent spent to defeat it. When we're talking about making decks more consistent, we want the floor of value that our cards to give us to be as high as possible, and Ruthless Raider does that better than Fett's Firespray. To make way for these cards, we are removing the Imperial Interceptors and 2 of our No Disintegrations. Imperial Interceptor is too limited in what it can do, with only being able to hit space units, and No Disintegrations is too slow of a card since it can never remove anything on its own. It will literally do nothing if your only opponent's unit has 1 health on it already, and that's not an uncommon situation to be in with all the indirect damage that we're putting out. Next up is the Radiant 7. I love this card. It can completely turn a game around if your opponent has a handful of units that are damaged, as they suddenly can't attack you for very much. It really makes your opponent think twice about where they're allocating the indirect damage that you're giving to them, but be aware that it doesn't affect leaders. So it's a downside, but not a deal breaker. I like to run 3 of them, and they replace the last No Disintegrations, the Electromagnetic Pulse, and the Grenade Strike. Electromagnetic Pulse and Grenade Strike, they're situational and often don't do enough to keep around as a single copy. The last of our units, the top end of our curve, it is Devastator, Hunting the Rebellion. This card ends games. Being able to control the indirect damage that you deal to your opponent is absolutely huge. If Boba Fett leader ability is triggered by Devastator's when played ability, you can do 5 damage straight to their base off of playing this, which is often enough to win because of all the other damage you're piling on earlier on in the game. Being able to swing for 9 on the next turn means it has to be dealt with right away. Because it's a card you can't play until late, I like to run 2 of them. For them, I remove both Elite P-38 Starfighters. The P-38 is good. It's really good. But we need room for our very top end game closers, and so it's a sacrifice that we just have to make. Lastly, we have the events. 2 copies of Sneak Attack. It's a great way to push damage and end games. It works particularly well with Ruthless Raider, but can also work with any of the big ships to end the game or force your opponent to spend a card on a ship that's already going to die. It can even get Darth Vader out on the ground for 5 resources to deal 7 damage. 2 copies of Surprise Strike. We're dealing a lot of damage. We want that extra reach. It can allow a smaller unit to trade up if you need. It's always a good value card. Also 2 copies of Waylay. This is going to clear up anything annoying that sticks. A lot of upgrade decks going on in the meta right now, so it can bump out a unit that's been upgraded and keep the tempo going in your favor. And 1 copy of Planetary Bombardment. I find that despite the huge number attached to Planetary Bombardment, it can often just do nothing for you. If you're behind on the board, your opponent can put the damage where they want it and usually keep their board. It does very little to aggro for that reason. However, it can be very, very good if you have Devastator or Radiant 7 out, because choosing where 12 damage goes often is the end of the game right there, or it's going to take away the attack power of all of the opposing units on the board, which can also be game ending in its own right. But with a floor that's pretty low, I'm happy with it being a 1 of. So the cards that we're going to be taking out for these events is the last of the piloting cards, just the 3 copies of Daring Raid, 1 copy of Forest Choke, and 1 No Good to Me Dead. While all of these cards have their purpose, we're replacing them with more utility and better value, and so they gotta go to make the room. These are a little bit more open in how you want to swap them, so I put them in order of priority, like reading a book, top left to bottom right, and how they should be replaced. You might value the cards a bit differently, and you can really do whatever you think is best. But the last card, as you'll notice that this isn't mathematically the same, that last card is the First Legion Stormtrooper replacement. I mentioned you're going to take that out first for any of the 6+ higher cards, so whatever cards left over from those swaps that didn't go, that would be the other card to take out. And now we're going to talk briefly about the sideboard. Sideboards are there for meta matchups that you want answers to. They can depend very much on what you're playing against locally. I like to run 3 copies of Cham Syndulla to keep up with ramp decks and help with hand solo matchups, 3 copies of Lurking TIE Phantom, as they really help with control, 3 copies of System Shock to deal with upgrade decks and trigger your leader ability, really good against Chewbacca or a shielded unit, and 1 copy of Change of Heart to take control of a big unit like Avenger or Devastator, and then use your opponent's top end against them. Okay, so after all of that, here is the final list that's ready for you to go and conquer your local store showdown or planetary qualifier event with. It really leans into getting your leader ability to trigger as often as possible, and also has the potential for very explosive plays from Darth Vader and Boba Fett being used as pilots. As I mentioned earlier, there are some non-legendary cards that can be used in place of the legendary cards. For Boba Fett Disintegrator, I would put in Toro Calican. Really not the same card as Boba Fett, but it has the potential to defeat 2 smaller cards before going down, and that is what we want against ground-based aggro. You won't get his ability off, but the 5 health should help you remove 2 units, get a 2-for-1 with him against aggro. For Darth Vader Scourge of Squadrons, I would put Boba Fett Feared Bounty Hunter back into the list. This keeps pilots in the list for those explosive plays, as well as triggering your leader ability, and it gives you that 5 resource play as a sticky unit that's kind of hard to remove if we need that. For the Radiant 7, I would put in IG-11. It's very much a different card. Nothing replaces the Radiant 7. It is too much of its own thing to just have another card kind of be a mini version of it. IG-11 is a strong 5-cost play. It works really well with our ability because you can then deal damage to damaged units on attack. While it does nothing when played, which does hurt, it often needs to be dealt with. It really starts pushing the end of the game. Devastator hunting the Rebellion, I would swap out and put in Emperor Palpatine. He's a great card on his own. He just doesn't make the list because it's a little bit too tight at the 8-cost spot, but dealing 6 damage amongst units is like an overwhelming barrage. It still gets lots of value. It still triggers the Boba Fett leader ability. If your opponent has tons of indirect damage built up, it can clear the board with a bunch of units. It's still good. And for Planetary Bombardment, I have Mini Planetary Bombardment, which is Torpedo Barrage. Dealing 5 damage for 3 is actually better value per indirect damage than dealing 8 damage for 6 if you don't have a capital ship out. And if you have Devastator out, 5 damage to base is also very, very solid. So for that reason, I think 1 copy of Torpedo Barrage would replace your Planetary Bombardment pretty well. Okay, that's it. There's a lot of cards that work with the Boba Fett leader ability that aren't on this list, and they might be cards that you find essential. If so, leave a comment on what changes you would make to the list so that others have more to consider when they're building it out for themselves. Thank you so much for watching my first guide on how to upgrade a Spotlight deck. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.